Good morning and thank you for joining us on today's webinar. Just to give you a bit of an update, if you want to ask any questions throughout the webinar, please use the dedicated Q&A section within Teams. We'll be answering those questions throughout the presentation and also covering the key topics that you raise at the end of the webinar over webcam. So today's webinar is around a quick guide to understanding how we can move to the cloud and specifically around moving to Microsoft Azure and looking at the processes involved in doing that in a secure and safe manner. So today's session will be hosted by myself, a business development manager here at Enhanced, alongside my colleague Jeff, who sits in the same team as me. And finally, we have Karim Descom, which is our head of engineering and our technical architect here at Enhanced, covering off the technicalities of a move to Azure. So today's agenda is we're going to first be covering off and demystifying Microsoft Azure. So we're going to be going through where we are with our current environment, understanding the previous concerns around Microsoft Azure and kind of how those have been resolved over a period of time. We'll be then looking at the use cases of Azure and how that relates to your environments at present. We'll be then going into the benefits of the product. And then finally, we'll be going through our cloud adoption framework, so understanding how you do kind of technical pre-sales to implementation to testing and final go live, and then also our initial process, which is our cloud readiness assessment. So I'm now going to hand over to my colleague Jeff, who's going to be covering off how we can demystify Microsoft Azure. By this, we mean looking at our current environment, how that would potentially transition to a public cloud, those previous concerns that we may have had about the public cloud offerings like Microsoft Azure, and the benefits that those solutions now offer us.
Thank you, Lewis, and good morning, everybody. So what I'm going to do first off is look at possibly how everyone's environments look today. So everyone who has attended today will be running their IT environment either entirely in-house or maybe partly or completely hosted on a third-party provider's own hosted platform. We know that the traditional way of running on-premise IT has carried many costs, including the cost to run the hardware and even the space that it takes up in an office or an HQ. Keeping the back-end IT on-premise needs maintaining and the hardware needs replacing at the end of its life, which brings large capital purchases every few years. On-premise IT has meant that IT managers have also struggled to expand services that the business often needs for them in a hurry, which can be down to the length of time it takes to buy new hardware and new licenses and implement them. Some of you here today may have taken the on-premise model to a slightly higher level by adopting the backup and even replication of your on-site services to a third-party hosted platform. And these types of services are proven to be very popular over the last few years. But due to the shortcomings of hosting servers on-site, it's become a trend to move the IT backend off-site and into a hosted data center where a third party is responsible for its upkeep, and also means that large capex purchases are moved to a monthly fee. But the problem with this approach for many started to occur when third parties providers realized that they could sweat the hardware age even longer than their customers had done when it was on premise. But many of these providers also kept the cost the same or even increased them over the years. And while this model does work for the services that I already mentioned, backup and site recovery, if you had your entire backup hosted in this way, services were still slow and inflexible, and poor billing is still rife in the market today. And so many customers, and there are many who are in this position still today, realized that they were paying for a service that was hosted on old hardware and even sometimes now incompatible with all the new applications coming out. So many companies signed up to these types of private cloud models before the public cloud had really entered the market, but things have rapidly changed. With Microsoft entering the market with Azure, we now continue to see them put massive investment into their infrastructure, into their data centers and services, and these can be consumed as and when they are needed. With Microsoft's money and expertise, they can grow their unlimited hardware and capacity and redundancy and provide easy management portals so that things can happen fast, along with easy to understand pay-as-you-go and pay upfront billing. Today we're going to explore how to start looking at the journey to Azure what core solutions are available, and how in the enhanced Azure migration framework can get you there. So starting at the very beginning, do you have buy-in from the business that going to a public cloud service is the right direction? So before we look at any technical assessment, we need to involve the key managers and directors and discuss with them how we see this move is going to help the business to realise its goals. Many directors may still be wary of the cloud and believe that keeping everything in-house is a much safer and secure strategy, and also believe that the costs of moving are far and away from any budget that they would assign. These concerns and misconceptions need to be addressed right at the start. So these are some of the things that we still come across at early discussions with businesses. Managers will say, I've seen the news, cloud isn't secure. Or we are a complex business, our applications will never work in Azure. Cloud services go down all the time. It's not been around long enough. How do we know what we're paying? We can't control these costs. Our company's too small for Microsoft Azure. Well, let's look at some of these in more detail. Azure data centers are top-tier state-of-the-art with every compliance certification available. They have multiple comms links and internal and external replication. When anything fails, hardware, comms, whatever, there are multiple routes to resilience and the money-back guarantee for Microsoft on uptime. Azure has been around now for a number of years, and the platform can be used to host one server for a small business or thousands of servers for a large enterprise. As you can go on a plan where you pay for what you use, you can, through their clever portals, manage when resources are being used or are turned off and control the costs down to minutes. In what are now very rare occurrences when an application will not run in Azure, there are a number of services or differing models that can be adopted to either get them to work as is or with a few little changes. So when we talk about Azure, we are actually talking about a public cloud service that encompasses over 600 services within it, and one that continues to grow as it, of course, has the might of Microsoft behind it. These services can be mostly split into platform services and infrastructure services, and we're going to cover some of these core ones today later in the webinar. So as you would expect from Microsoft, they provide all the latest infrastructure in their data centers, and you get access to it for a monthly fee. Also, tasks like creating new virtual servers or applying more resources, memory, storage, etc., are all done through easy to use web portals and executed as you do them, so there's no waiting around for a third party to do it for you. And they use automation in the background to get these fully configured fast. So the Microsoft Azure footprint is of course worldwide, and they have loads of data centers pretty much in every country in the world. This though means that they can deliver services from local data centers. Our local ones are London, Durham and Cardiff at the moment, but ever expanding. They then also use availability zones to replicate data and services so that customer data is always accessible and available. Every business, wherever they are in the world nowadays, has to comply with various standards, and Azure conforms to pretty much all of them, so ISOs, PCI DSS, etc., etc. In recent years, we've seen massive take-up from local government, the NHS, and even the MOD are now able to use Azure services purely because of what Microsoft have done in terms of addressing all the compliance requirements around the world. So when we look at this slide, we start to get a handle on what Azure as a service actually encompasses. But of course, the beauty of the ecosystem is that we can pick and choose which services we wish to run. So when looking at Azure migration, we are normally looking at Windows or Linux servers, which may or may not be virtual machines, and bringing these into Azure with the Azure storage options that's best for each scenario, i.e. blob, file storage or premium storage. It may also be that we have a customer that is looking to put their system development in Azure or just some SQL databases, and we can choose which options are the best fit for these. Azure also majors on security and management, and moving Active Directory into Azure and deploying multi-factor authentication plays a large role in most migrations that we do. Connectivity also plays a large role, and in some cases Microsoft Express Route can be used to provide a direct link into the service. There are a whole load of other services that cover development, project management, mobile apps, and the Internet of Things, which is growing massively and being fueled by Microsoft's desire to expand its edge computing solutions. This is where data is processed by a device locally, and this is packaged for much smaller data packages so that they are sent to the data center, which cuts down on latency and bandwidth issues. So Lewis is now going to be covering a number of these core options in more detail.
Thanks, Jeff. Over the next few slides, I'm going to be covering off the use cases for Azure, specifically around how that kind of translates from our on-premise infrastructure to kind of Azure's dedicated services and looking at the benefits that that delivers us. So in this first section, I want to be talking around platform as a service. The thing to kind of get your head around here is that traditionally with an on-premises infrastructure, we're looking at kind of compute and storage and how we scale that over a 3 to 5 year basis, using that as kind of a dedicated pool of resource to use for multiple services. With platform as a service, Microsoft offer a way of looking at dedicated products to cover specific needs. For instance, Azure Files is a dedicated file server solution without the need to look at the OS, the traditional disk behind that, the storage and compute. The benefits of that is that we can utilize other services with Azure Files, such as replication to an on-site file server at locations that may need local access. We can then look at, say, something like an Azure SQL database. Again, we're provided with a database on the latest version of SQL, no need for the maintenance there, and utilizing that specific requirement. Active Directory domain services, again, negates the need for a traditional domain server. So we're getting the access to the functions that we need from a domain perspective without the ongoing maintenance. And Windows Virtual Desktop, for those that haven't looked at this product, is kind of the replacement for RDS but delivered entirely out of Azure using Windows 10 as a base rather than Windows Server. So as a platform as a service solution, Microsoft are looking after a number of the kind of core functionality you would have to traditionally manage and maintain in an RDS environment, stuff like gateways and brokers. That's all dealt with, and you're just dealing with how much resource do I need to deliver my users day to day. So moving on from platform as a service, we have Azure's infrastructure as a service solutions. Some more kind of a typical deployment that you would look at in your kind of private cloud hosting environments of kind of present. So whether that be virtual machines, which we can size on a CPU, GPU and RAM basis, and then adding additional storage into that, whether that be blob or file storage that we discussed previously. And again, there's different tiers of storage within these, whether that be for archival purposes, whether you need premium storage, so SSD based storage, so we can specifically size our storage around requirement rather than looking at a lump of storage for everything and then kind of divvying that out. We can actually size this per requirement. And then we've got Azure Stack if we're looking at kind of hybrid environments and particular deployments around that. And then finally looking at connectivity. So Microsoft offer what's known as express route, so direct routing into the Azure infrastructure for low latency. So this can be tied onto your existing MPLS networks to get you that kind of low latency experience into the cloud. And from a backup and disaster recovery standpoint, Microsoft have a kind of end-to-end solution available for both options really. So if we're remaining on premise, we can use Azure Backup for our existing environments. Again, if that's hybrid, we can utilize the same technology. And if we're totally in Azure and having migrated all our services, we can use that Azure Backup again. Whether that be to a single data center or globally redundant, the functionality is there. Alongside that, they also include instant restore options for up to kind of 7 snapshots, so we can boot up those machines similar to kind of Veeam Instant Restore if you're utilizing kind of that technology on site at the moment. In addition to this, we've got Azure Site Recovery for our replication, again whether that be on-premise into Azure using our Azure infrastructure as a disaster recovery and business continuity solution, or if we're utilizing services within Azure, we could look to replicate to a second region. And finally, and kind of most importantly, is the powerful management that's included in part with Microsoft Azure. So rather than our on-premise infrastructure where we may have VMware for vCenter looking at our virtual infrastructure, you might have something separate for our networking infrastructure, and again just a general monitoring tool for the whole environment. Microsoft provide a full set of technologies that we can kind of monitor all aspects of it, whether it be the infrastructure as a service or security. So the three kind of main ones that we're outlining here are the Azure portal, where we can do our configuration from, Azure Advisor, where we're looking at optimizing our solution, and then Azure Monitor to look at the actual system itself and the performance of that. In the next section, I'm going to be covering off how Microsoft Azure is priced for both a licensing perspective as well as a kind of server and resource perspective, which is one of the most commonly asked questions around Azure and understanding your kind of total cost of ownership. So first of all, we're going to be covering off how the kind of server and resource is priced. So there's two kind of typical models for this, both pay-as-you-go and reserved instances. So pay-as-you-go is an ultimately flexible model, so you could, as it says, you pay per the minute for your consumption. So kind of use cases for this may be that when you're doing an initial proof of concept and kind of development stage, you may kind of utilize your resources on that whilst you establish the level of resource required on a long-term basis, and potentially look at using reserved instances, which are kind of reserved spaces on the platform for a specific amount of time, whether that be 1 or 3 years. Another reason that you may look to go pay-as-you-go is that you've got very kind of flexible resource requirements. So for instance, say you were Center Parks and you know you've got very high usage at particular times of the year when you know that people are going to be visiting, say, the website over the Christmas period. You can scale up very quickly and then scale back as quickly as well once you know that kind of requirement is going to drop down. Another kind of use case would have been, say, in March, if you had a small Windows virtual desktop deployment. When COVID came about, you could have then scaled up dramatically to increase your usage for that remote usage over kind of the lockdown period, and then potentially scale that back again. Reserved instances, as I've kind of just alluded to, are reserved kind of server instances. So once you've established what your kind of static resource is going to look like, then you can reserve those server resources for 1 or 3 year periods at a dramatically kind of reduced price. But you're utilizing that kind of 24/7, while with pay-as-you-go, if you know actually my usage overnight is going to be less, or we only use it Monday to Friday, you could scale your resource on pay-as-you-go potentially to save money there as well. So with Windows Server licensing, there's a couple of options here again. So you can utilize your licenses on a pay-as-you-go perspective alongside your kind of Azure server resources. The other option is that you bring your own license, which is known as Azure Hybrid Benefit. So if you've got existing licenses on premises that you've got software assurance on, then there's the option to move those across. So if you're using, say, Windows Server Standard, every 8 cores that you're licensed can license you a virtual machine up to 8 cores within Azure. So it's a minimum of 8 cores assigned per virtual machine. If you're utilizing data center license, however, you still only get those 2 virtual machines, or you can license a whole dedicated host within Azure, but then you're not kind of utilizing specific resources for each of your services. You're going to have to cut that up yourself using that kind of host server. The other kind of licensing methods to get your licensing, if you're looking at buying new, you can utilize CSP. So those licenses are now available via the cloud service provider model. So you can buy Windows Server and SQL, or you can continue to using the open licensing model, taking into account that multiple licensing is kind of being phased out at the end of next year. Your OVS licensing will still be available, but your traditional multiple licensing won't be. So if you've got those licenses, then if you've got software assurance, then bring those forward, great. Otherwise, look at, say, purchasing those on Windows Server licenses on CSP, but data center isn't there at the moment if you're looking at licensing a whole host server. So the cost savings of bringing your own license with a reserved instance is 80%. That's including the reserved instance cost. And if you bring those licenses to kind of traditional other models like pay-as-you-go, then that's going to reduce your cost by up to 40%. So it was a dramatic cost saving by pre-purchasing those licenses. So I'm now going to hand over to my colleague Jeff to cover the benefits of using Azure. Now that we've kind of discussed and understand the kind of underlying infrastructure requirements, what benefits does Azure kind of offer over and above the solutions that we're using at present?
Thanks, Lewis. So before we move on to cover the enhanced Azure adoption framework, let's have a bit of a recap and cover some of the real key benefits of Azure. So from business leaders, we generally see the push to migrate from organizations that are in a real state of flux. So maybe a merger or an acquisition has triggered a refresh, or they've even reached the natural refresh cycle of maybe 5 or even in some cases 7 years. Many customers have migrated simply because their on-premise or privately hosted environment is holding the business back from innovating new products or services. And some are also pursuing the green agenda, which is of course provided by a cloud service. IT directors and managers are frustrated by how long changes take with an on-premise IT environment, or even having to wait for a private cloud provider to perform. Some are looking for that flexibility and ramp things up and down as the business asks for it. Again, IT personnel or even IT security personnel in some large companies love the fact that Azure complies with all the needed standards, and they can sleep at night knowing that systems and data are secure, and even if there were a Microsoft outage, that the resilience in the system will take care of things. Any FDs really want to get rid of large capex cycles, and they have to try to budget for these, and also know that they can look at each month's usage and know what they are paying for, control these costs, and even cross-charge across departments. We've covered the core areas of Azure. We've looked at the benefits, the business benefits, platform as a service, infrastructure as a service, but how do we get you there, and how can Enhanced get you there? Well, Enhanced really have adopted from the Microsoft framework our own Azure Cloud Adoption Framework. And now we're going to get Karim, who we introduced at the beginning today, who's head of technical here at Enhanced, to cover off our framework, all the elements, and how Enhanced can really help you to migrate.
Thanks, Jeff, and welcome everyone. Here at Enhanced, we are firm believers that our cloud adoption framework model is the key reason as to why we have and continue to be able to successfully migrate our customers to the cloud. We break this down into the following elements: strategy, planning, implementation, optimization, and go live. During the strategy phase, we undertake a pre-assessment. This is to understand the business's specific strategic objectives by moving to the cloud. We discuss project motivation, and then we conduct a high-level technical review. Planning. We perform a cloud readiness assessment which assesses the current infrastructure and then provides an output report which details budgetary pricing. During this phase, we also determine which workloads are suitable for cloud adoption and rate their compatibility, and then we determine whether or not a proof of concept phase is actually required. The Cloud Readiness Assessment allows us to work at a strategic level to explore the business cloud needs and ambitions. We have refined a process that allows us to output the Cloud VM readiness, determining which servers are ready, which require patches or upgrades, networking and storage requirements based on utilization, making sure that additional services such as ExpressRoute and Premium Tier SSD is advised and costed where appropriate, and finally a scalability review to see if there are any cost-saving benefits for the business to scale up and down the infrastructure in and out of working hours as required. Now this brings us on to a point worth mentioning, especially for everyone that's on the webinar live today. You will be entitled to have a free of charge cloud readiness assessment. Typically, this is a one-day piece of consultancy. It covers everything from the previous slide. And on completion, we'll actually provide you with a summary report that includes a view of the suitability of all your applications and budgetary costs of what these will look like in Azure. We often see this report being used as a discussion point at board or management level, and it gets the buy-in from the business to move to the next stage. So it's really useful thing to have done. We've done many of these, and customers have told us that it's really helped them to actually sell the concept of a cloud migration and a migration to Azure within their various businesses. So one of us will be contacting you after the webinar today to hopefully set a few of these free of charge cloud readiness assessments up for you. Right, moving on to the next part of our cloud adoption framework model. This is the implementation phase. Now, depending on whether or not a proof of concept has been deemed necessary from the planning phase, we will look to deliver this in the implementation phase. We will then be creating a migration plan, followed by migrating and/or creating workloads in the cloud. Once completed, we will then hand this over for testing. So the assessments have taken us so far, but a proof of concept is really the only real way to show how certain services will run and behave, and what tweaks may be needed to see the benefits in performance and stability that the business wants to see. This is where we can really address any red flags that may have been highlighted at the assessment stage, and we can look at producing a report during the proof of concept that managers or board members can review before moving on to the next phase of the actual migration. And as a Microsoft Cloud Gold adoption partner, we have access to free licenses for up to 2 months for some of the larger projects that we undertake. Now, the next few slides are about the way that we build and migrate workloads into a cloud environment, typically in an Azure environment. This is about the methodology that we use and the different benefits of the different approaches. So the first thing that we can do is we can rehost or lift and shift. This is probably better for, I would say, legacy migrations or scenarios where downtime is limited and we may need to move quickly. I'll caveat with this approach may not make use of the cloud native resources in the best way possible. Therefore, you may find that even doing a lift and shift will require some form of optimization after to really realize the benefit of moving to Azure. Another migration strategy is to actually refactor or repackage an application. Now, this tends to be suitable for sensitive and business critical applications where disruption or ongoing functionality is a concern, but there is actually a business need to modernize and improve the underlying infrastructure that these applications reside on. The real drawback of doing this way is you can't make architectural changes. For example, splitting the application into microservices, and that you can't really structure it. But for most businesses, this doesn't tend to be an issue. Moving on to the next approach, and probably my favorite because the design's the fun bit, right? This is to re-architect. So this is a strategy that involves revamping the way that you're essentially using and utilizing your applications, and we would do this for maximum agility, scalability and flexibility in the cloud environment. So essentially what you would be looking at is a highly scalable and resilient but easy deployable service that you can leverage. This may be spanned across multiple regions, It may spin up and spin down in different regions as required. So it can be some complexity to it, but this really maximizes the benefit of going to the cloud, and you can see some real cost savings dependent on how you structure the infrastructure. You can see some significant cost savings doing it this way. The other drawback of this is due to the complexity, and if you don't fully understand your cost management, it can be quite expensive. But like I say, this is by far and away our preferred approach, and obviously, who doesn't like redesigning stuff? Now, whilst the re-architect is the desirable approach, let's say, rebuild is the one that is most common. So essentially what this would involve is building up a new platform for your application or service in tandem, typically with where it's running at the moment, and then migrating the data over in a structured manner. It's typically the most inexpensive way, which is easy for me to say, avoids the complexity of software licenses, and there's no dependency really on like middleware or existing infrastructure to do it in this approach. I would say this is generally the most adopted method that we see in the majority of migrations that we undertake and are a part of. Right, moving on to the next part of our cloud adoption framework model, and this is optimization. At the optimization phase, your workloads would have already been migrated to the cloud and handed over for final testing. This phase is really crucial for us to be able to deliver the performance a business and their end users expect when migrating to the cloud. We will be looking to conduct a final UAT process with appropriate sign-off, along with ensuring the relevant security reviews and best practices have been put firmly in place. Finally, we'll look at configuring monitoring and performance benchmarking to provide ongoing reassurances to the business and the end users. So we can't say it enough. Feedback, feedback, and you guessed it, feedback. Without this, we cannot have a successful deployment to the cloud. This is both from a business and end user perspective. The way we structure our UAT is that we would have already defined and documented a scope of work followed by a clear testing plan, so this can be communicated to users who will be testing as part of UAT. We can then review this and address any issues or concerns for further testing if required. So, environment optimizations. Now, we're covering this under the UAT environment, and we're saying we can make all these optimizations, but this is really an ongoing process and part and parcel of what you will see in terms of the value we can bring to these type of deployments when we do the migrations, and ongoing in terms of our support. So we'll continually be looking to provide optimizations, one, for performance, and two, to reduce costs for the business. So this will be stuff like, migrating workloads onto reserved instances for periods of time. So you may have some machines that you're using on pay as you go. You may have some machines that you're using on a 1 year reserved instance because you're planning on, after a year, removing that service or no longer requiring it. And then you may have some that are going to be long standing that you want to keep in place on a 3 year reserved instance to really drive down that cost. And we can help you mix and match that. And like I say, it's an ongoing part of our support and maintenance of the platform. Performance, again, we'll be looking at this regularly with our monitoring and the metrics that we have in place to ensure that everything's performing as it should. And if it turns out that 6 months down the line there's something wrong, we can have a conversation about it, and we can say, look, we've noticed that this server is typically busier during this times, and we think that X will help. And that's, again, a value add for what we do. So whilst we do this as part of the initial UAT to really fine tune everything and get everything working for go live as it should be, this is an ongoing thing that we will continue to do as part and parcel of our working relationship with you. So moving on, what's the point of building a platform in Azure if it's not secure? And this is what we hear time and time again, and this is a real concern for a lot of businesses as to, you know, being able to secure their data. So what we like to do is give some reassurances around the three main areas as we see them. This is the visibility, control, and threat detection. So we ensure that with the monitoring and the tools that we provide, that we have complete visibility for the entire cloud infrastructure. So we always know what's going on, and we can react and be proactive in circumstances where necessary. We can control, so we can shape your cloud environment, and we do use this with granular tools and policy settings. A lot of these are inbuilt into your Microsoft 365 subscriptions, so stuff like DLP, conditional access. These type of tools, we'll look to leverage these as well, because if you're already paying for them, we might as well leverage them, and they're really good industry standard tools. These are stuff that you know, we practice what we preach in that regard. We use these tools ourselves internally for our environment. So if it's, you know, why wouldn't we use it for our customers, especially as if it's included. And then finally, threat detection. Now this is an ongoing thing, and this comes back to what I mentioned about proactivity. So threat detection isn't just about identifying a threat and reacting to that threat. It's about learning pattern behavior. So we work with a variety of products that have this machine learning AI capability, whereby it can actually learn what the pattern of behavior is typically, and then react accordingly if there's a break in that pattern or a change to that pattern. And it usually will identify it as a threat. So this is really proactive, this is cutting edge stuff, and this is taking your threat detection and prevention to the next level. So last but definitely not least is go live. This is a post-deployment process where we configure platform administration, implement cost management, and ensure compliance with company processes and policies are actually adhered to. This brings a conclusion to my elements for today. So I'd like to thank you all for your time, and I'm going to pass back over to Jeff, who's going to go over what you can expect from an ongoing support perspective from go live and beyond with Enhanced. Thanks.
Thanks, Karim. So once we've obviously got you live, the next stage really is to help you support and maintain the environment. And Enhanced have been in business for over 25 years, and we have a very mature service department where we provide a number of types of services to provide our customers with IT support. So these range from fully managed through to co-managed and even pay-as-you-go systems. So there obviously are some benefits to fully outsourcing your IT, such as you can see on the slide, and our experienced support team. We provide regular health checks within our support managed service. We're very proactive, looking after licenses. So again, when we're looking at Azure environments with Microsoft 365 environments, we can look after all that license management. We provide you with a virtual IT director in the full outsource. So looking after the conduit really between IT and the business. And all our services, we can provide network monitoring and also security management. If you do have an IT department in place, and maybe we're assisting you with an Azure migration, again, once you're in Azure, do you have the skills to maintain it, or are you looking for really some knowledge transfer, and would a co-managed support service help you? So this is where we're not looking after everything within the IT environment, but we're helping you, we're helping your IT team look after it, and really under a very flexible model where we come in and assist where is needed.